The Fantasy Grounds Academy. Today I'm going to go through and do a little setup and tips for running combat in Fantasy Grounds. So if you are a newer GM or you've been using Fantasy Grounds for a while and you're still kind of confused or maybe get a little lost, whatever it may be, hopefully this will help you. So essentially, just for a little of the preamble, some of the basically the content around this is essentially I have 5 characters that are already built. They're first level. And then in my library, I have the core rule books, and then I have the module Lost Mine and Fendelver, and then I also have my pre-gen setup here that I use for loading these characters in. So I made these pre-gens in a different campaign. So nonetheless, I'm going to close the modules thing. So I have that loaded. I have my 5 players here. So the first thing I'm going to do, whether they're at the table or not, is add them to the combat tracker. So once the characters are fully built, I'm going to add each one of these to the combat tracker. There is no way to do this all at once. I wish there was, but at this time there isn't. So there's that. I'm going to go ahead and close this. And then if this is a long-running campaign where we're going to be playing more than once or twice, I'm going to go ahead and add them to the party sheet. So the benefit of this for the Game Master is you get an overview of the party as a group. And what I'm doing is taking the link on the right-hand side, grabbing it, and dragging it over. So that's a tip that you could use for setting up your campaign. So if you want to award them with experience points, and you want to award your players with treasure, and also completion of goals and milestones with the story XP or that sort of stuff. So in campaign, you have story awards, which allows you to reward your players for completing a certain segment of your adventure. So what I'm going to do now is start setting up my table. So that's kind of what the first part of this is really just kind of getting your feng shui set up here. So here are all the players from the combat tracker to the party sheet. So the party sheet gives you an overview. You can do group roles from here. So if I had a challenge rating, I could plug that in. So let's just say they were trying to find an elusive goblin that was hiding somewhere, and they're kind of on the prowl looking for him. So what we could do is roll the goblin stealth, plug in the number into the DC challenge rating. So let's say he rolled pretty high. Let's say he rolled an 18. And then we're going to roll that against perception. So if I scroll down to the perception, what's going to happen is if I roll now, it's going to roll in the chat in public so the players can see it. Or if I want to change the visibility, I can actually turn the eyeball off here, which hides the roll results. And now when I click this button for the skill check, it's going to roll everyone's perception against the DC challenge rating of 18 to discover the goblin. So when I roll that, it lets me know who succeeds or fails. So it looks like I had 3 failures and 2 successes. So this is how you can kind of get an idea of group roll without having to even say anything to your group. And it's hidden. So they'll know you rolled dice, but they'll have no idea why or what it's for. Unless you make it visible. In that case, you can click on show results again and then roll. And if this eye is illuminated here, that means, or if it's dark, that means that they're able to see. So I'm going to move the party sheet over to the bottom right because that's where I want this to pop up every time I do and run this campaign. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. But when I open the party sheet again, it's going to go where I left it. So if I click on this, it's going to go where I left it. Same thing with the combat tracker. I kind of have it positioned and stretched to where I want it. When I actually close that and I click on the combat tracker button again, it's going to go where you left it. So that's one of the key things in Fantasy Grounds to remember is when you open a window for the first time, it's always going to open in the center. So to prove my point, I'll open up encounters and you can see it's right smack dab in the center. But if you don't want this window to open up there again, you move it wherever you want it to go. And sometimes you won't know right away until you play for a while, but once you get an idea, you can position it there and close it. When you need it to come back up, you click it again, that window will be where you left it. It'll start becoming more second nature, and you won't be fighting the interface as much. And that's what a lot of us do in the beginning when we're using Fantasy Grounds, is it's very tough to kind of manage the window, especially if you have a small screen. So one of the things you want to get in the habit of is taking a new window, moving it, sizing it. So if you want it a little bigger, do that first and then close it. Next time you bring it up, it's going to be where you left it. It's a very important aspect of learning how to manage the desktop. Next thing I'm going to do is I have all my players on the combat tracker that I put on here earlier, and I pulled all those from the actual character area for the players under character. Just drag and drop these over onto the combat tracker, and these are completed character sheets. So I'm going to click on each one of the tokens and bring up this link on the right. I'm going to bring up each character, and I'm going to line them up like a deck of cards. And the reason I'm doing this is because I don't want 5 of them across the screen. I just want this one panel. And this is where you can kind of use the desktop or your play space as more of an efficient way of laying things out. So all I'm doing right now is getting all the character sheets placed in this panel. And that way, when I go to run this encounter, and if I need to look at someone's character sheet, they're all right in one spot, and I don't have to have them spread across the interface. So this is kind of how I do it. So once I have them in place and I have them at the size that I want, I can go ahead and close these. And when I need to bring them up, I recall them from the combat tracker. So for instance, if we're at round 0, so I'm going to actually, on the left-hand side of the combat tracker, I'm going to click there. That's going to select the first person in this group. There's no initiative order yet, but what will happen is if I click on the link on the right, it's going to bring up whatever character I want. So if I have to skip back over to the High Elf, I can just click on the link. It brings that sheet up to the top. And that's one of the really basic things in Fantasy Grounds that can really change the game. It sounds really simple and maybe a little silly, but nonetheless, there are people who are fighting this. They got their character sheets all across the screen, and it's covered up something else, and it just becomes a big mess if you don't learn how to manage the windows. So just remember, whenever you first open any data, it's going to open in the center until you move it. Once you understand that, it makes it so much easier to manage this table, because you kind of put things where you want them to go. And once they're there, even if they get covered up, all you have to do is click on the data link again, and it brings it up to the top. So instead of moving everything around and shuffling everything every time you need something, you put it where you want it or where you expect it to go, and it will stay there unless you do something drastic on the back end, like delete your module state. So this is just a way to organize the characters. So this is a good way to make that happen. So I'm going to bring up an encounter that comes up in play during the Lost Mine of Fandelver campaign. So first things first is I want to go to the story entry and use that as my reference. So I'm going to actually use the reference manual instead of the story entries, because that's how the modules are being created. So if I go to modules and I go to Lost Mine of Fandelver, this is the actual data window for modules. I'm going to actually bring this over to the right in case I have to pull it up again. I don't want it in the center. So then I'm going to have to go to the actual reference manual, which is down here on the bottom, and click on that. That brings up the reference window, which is essentially the book. So with the book, I can come through here and navigate to what content I want. So we're going to be doing part 1, and I'm going to come down to the part where they actually reach the Kragma hideout. So there's a chapter here called Kragma hideout. If I click on that, that brings this up. And this is the actual page or the actual book. So I just stretch this out. You can see that it reveals all of the content here. And if you look on here, the DM map is on here. That has all the labels. That's what this is, essentially. and then you have your Kragma Hideout battle map, which is what you're going to be used to playing on. So I don't really need the DM's version of the map, but if you do, you can bookmark it. So what I mean by bookmarking is to make this encounter easier and to get a good starting point. What I recommend you do is bring out this, pop this page out, which is up here on the top where it says Kragma Hideout, and this will be similar in a lot of other adventures and rule sets. So I'm going to click this on, and you see it's right in the middle where I don't want it. So I'm going to go ahead and place this somewhere where it's not going to be in my way constantly. And I'm actually going to use this as kind of my starting point when I run this encounter. So I might have this sitting here. And when I bring this page back up, that's where I want it to appear. So I'm going to actually take this link that's on the top left corner, drag and drop it down to the hotkey. So if I come back to this, I don't necessarily have to come back to this page. I can actually close that. When I'm getting ready to start the adventure, I bring up the reference manual. There is the DM map, which I will probably just put up here where I'm going to actually put the player map to, so I have access to it when I need it. And once I have it sized to the actual position and the frame size that I want, I'm going to close it because I don't need it right now. But if I do and I bring that back up, it's going to go where I left it. So if I click that again, it's going to be right where I want it. And that's an important thing to know. So if I'm going to go ahead and close this, then I'm going to bring up the battle map. And what this battle map does is this is where we're going to be playing and where I'm going to take and put the player characters to set up the encounter. So essentially, I'm setting up the tabletop and I'm setting up the space, and I'm also setting up where I want all the windows to be. So this is kind of the part of the setup, is to actually get these windows where you want them to go. And you can see this map's a little small, so all I have to do is either right click, go to view, and zoom to fill, or you can unlock this map, and let's just say the map's like way over here or something like that. You can click on this little down symbol and then click on zoom to fit, and it will recenter it, and then you can lock it. So this is just the map that we're going to be using for this encounter. Here's all the story parts, and then you can use these page images on the bottom to go through the different pages. So this is what you want to actually look at when you're running the adventure to read, or you can read it out of the reference manual. This is just a shortcut straight out of the reference manual. So I'm going to zoom in, and there's two encounters here. One is this cave mouth that details the goblins. It tells you what's going on and how things are supposed to go. So I'm going to go ahead and take this first part. I'm going to stretch it and have it match just like this. And then as I do this, I will basically be able to run the adventure and use the arrows on the bottom to navigate through the pages. So this is the cave mouth. It says, if I click on this little bubble, it's going to send the chat to there so the players can read it, or you can read it out loud. I usually have one of the players read it for me, and I think that's occasionally okay. It depends on what the situation is, but it says, following the goblin's trail, you come across a large cave in a hillside 5 miles from the scene of the ambush. So this was after the goblin ambush. A shallow stream flows out of the cave mouth, which is screened by a dense briar thicket, which are these bushes. A narrow, dry path leads into the cave on the right-hand side of the stream. So normally when we start this section, we're going to be starting over here on this bottom corner. You don't have to, but this is essentially where it's going to go. And if you notice, some of the map is off a little bit, which is going to happen occasionally. If that is the case and that drives you bananas, you can try to adjust it, but just remember that these have already been stretched and adjusted, but I don't know why that's off. But you can unlock the map. You can go to the grid, and in this case, I'm just going to hit this down arrow once, and that gets it a lot closer. And then I can use this little marginal button here, really small amount of measurement, to get that lined up more in the center. So if you go look at that and then you go to a different part of the map and it's off, way off there, then you got an issue where the map isn't very square. But this one's pretty squared up, so we're okay. So they've already fixed the map. I think that's just slightly off. I don't know why, but nonetheless, no big deal. So I'm going to go ahead and lock this again. And what we're going to do at this point is we're going to start adding the players to the map. So once you have everything set, you're going to start adding assets to the map where you want them to go. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the players, but what you can do if you don't want to grab them individually or you want to retain some sort of marching order, you can go back to that party sheet that we had up earlier. And as you can see, it came up here on the bottom corner like I wanted it to. I'm going to go over to order, and I'm going to put these characters in order. So we're going to be facing north. That's what this arrow is here. So generally, I have the main folk hero, kind of the main warrior. I guess this is the human noble. So he's going to be up front. Normally, that's how I have it. The human folk hero that has mostly a bow and it kind of watches the back end is going to be back here. The rogue is going to be here towards the back. The high elf acolyte, which is an actual wizard, is going to be in the center. And then the dwarven soldier, the cleric, is going to be up here in front. So this is the marching order. So if you use the arrows here, you can actually rotate it to change what position they're facing. So in this case, they'll be facing north. So if I take this little shield or this little helmet down here, or if I do it on the combat tracker, I can drag that to the map and they should retain that order, provided I drop it in a good spot. But being that this doesn't have a lot of room, I'm going to actually adjust this a little bit. So I'm going to take and move stuff around. So there is the barbarian. I'm going to move up the archer. I'm going to move the rogue down a little bit and the wizard, and I'm going to put the cleric right here. So I just changed that just for the sake of room. And now I'm going to take and drag and drop this, and what it does is it allocates the way that you have this set up on the party sheet. So now that it's on there, if you look carefully, I'm going to go ahead and click on the map. And as you can see, here are the players on the map. So this is the way that you can actually drop them in as a group, or you can drag them individually if you want to. It depends on what your needs are. Now there is an encounter here. It says the thicket in area 2 is impenetrable from the west side of the stream, so you can't go through this, supposedly. The goblins are supposed to be keeping an eye on this area, but they are not paying attention. Goblins can be lazy in that way. However, if the characters make a lot of noise here, for example, like loudly arguing about what to do next, setting up camp, cutting down bushes, and so on and so forth, they'll notice that and they'll attack through the thicket. And that provides the goblins with 3/4 cover. So that would be +5 or a -5 penalty, depending on how you want to look at it, in regards to shooting through the bushes. So that gives them a nice cover, but it hampers the players. So anyways, this is the actual encounter. So if I open this up, this explains how the encounter is going to work. So if I go to the right, this is the encounter. The encounter and the text are linked on this page, so I can pop up the encounter. And if I add this to the combat tracker, they'll appear on the map, but they're not visible yet to the players or to anyone that's actually connected to the table. It's still invisible, and they're right there. That's where they're located. If you want to move them at this point, you can. So I might put one down there and leave this guy right here. So it's just up to you what you want to do. So they're not visible to the players yet, and they're not visible on the map yet, and they're not invisible on the combat tracker, not yet. So this is where you want to be when you're getting ready to start an encounter. You already have your NPCs placed or ready to go. Your players are on their starting position, wherever that might be. And then you will get ready to run the adventure or the encounter at this point. So these are already placed, so that's what these little arrows mean. However, if you didn't like their starting locations to begin with, or you wanted to create your own encounter, you could very well do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to propose to make another encounter for reinforcements. So that is an eventuality that might happen. It's not designed in the adventure. However, you may want to make this encounter a little tougher. So if you got an experienced group, you can actually just unlock this encounter, and you can change this number 3 to 4, and then you refresh the CR rating and the experience points. So now it's actually a CR1 challenge rating instead of a CR half. And there's 2 that are placed and 2 that are not placed. So I can go ahead and grab one of these tokens that aren't placed and put them where I want them to show up at. So what I'll do is I'll have one in the cave mouth, like right here. Actually, I'll put him on the stairs. There's a dog kennel over here. And then I'll put one more of them down here with the other guys. So there's the guys that I just placed. Now they're not on the combat tracker because they weren't originally a part of this encounter. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to delete these 2 goblins off here because I want them all to go on at the same time now that they're all replaced. So I'm going to go ahead and lock the encounter. I don't need to make any more changes. So I just updated the encounter and made it a little tougher. So that might be something you have to do, is adjust encounters depending on the situation and what's going on in your game. So you might have to do a little adjustment here and there. But that just basically doubled the threat there. It makes it a lot more complicated just by adding those 2 goblins. Now there's another cool thing you can do with an encounter like this. If you're going to run this adventure more than once, like if you're an Adventures League GM or someone who plays an organized play, and you play these modules over and over and over, it gets kind of annoying if you have to keep adjusting the encounters. If you're only going to use it once, probably no big deal, but if you're going to run this encounter several times, you can build an encounter to sort of scale with your party size. And how you do that is by, first, you're going to create your own encounter. So what I'm going to do is go to the encounters area. I'm going to make a copy of this goblin blind. That way I don't mess with the original. So I'm going to put this back to where it was by unplacing those guys. And then I'm going to make a copy of it, but I'm going to change this. I'm going to actually drag and drop this encounter so it's now a copy of the original. And then I'm going to reduce the original back to 2 the way it was. And that was the way it was designed. The copy, however, has 4 in case I want to use this for a different encounter, or I want to increase the encounter. So what I'll do here is I will put in parentheses revised, or actually I'll put tougher. Something like that, like harder, just so I know the difference between the 2. And then on the group level up here on the top, I'm going to drop this down, click on this green plus button, which is add category, and it's going to call it group 1 by default. And I'm going to put Lost Mine, Offend, Delver, Edit. So I know that these are the ones that I changed and that are not part of the adventure. So now what's going to happen is I'm going to drag this link up to this revised area. I'll just put edit on here. And that way I know that this is the one that I messed with. These are the changes that I made for my adventure. So I'm going to drag this and put it up into this category. So this is the one that's not attached to the module. This is the copy, the harder one. So I'm going to go ahead and left click and drag it up to that group. So now it has its own group. So anytime I make changes or edits to the original, I'm going to put them in this edited part, which is only going to be the stuff that I've altered or copied or changed or added. So I could just add my own encounter and call it whatever I want. You do that by clicking on this green plus button, and then you drag NPCs into here according to what you want. There's another way of doing this also, and that's what I was mentioning earlier, is that you can create a random encounter which is going to scale according to the size of your party. It doesn't take in consideration the party level or the CR levels or anything like that, but it does allow you to scale it. So if you go to random encounters, there are a couple that are already existing in the adventure. So I'm going to go ahead and make another group. And again, this is going to be my lost mine offend over edits, because anything that I alter or change, I want to make a group for it. That way, if I want to export it or do something with it later, I can. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of the edit mode, and then I'm going to select this, which is empty right now. And I'm going to create a new random encounter. So what I'm going to call this is cave mouth reinforcements. We'll just call it that. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab those goblins from the other encounter, and I can either grab it from the NPC pile or I can steal it from the original calendar. So in this encounter, I'm going to go ahead and drag the NPC from here, because that's the one I want to use. It's the same ones that are used in the adventure. And then right now it says example 1d6. So you can have it roll, so you can get the number of goblins that you want within a range of numbers. Or you can say, okay, I want X amount of goblins times or multiplied or divided, subtract, +1 or whatever. So what I'm going to do is put the $ symbol and PC. So that's uppercase. So $ PC -1. So what that means is it's going to look at the party sheet, not the combat tracker, but the party sheet. And when it looks at that, it's going to go, oh, okay. So on the party sheet, I've got 5 players. So technically this should give us 4. So if I click generate, it's exactly what it did. So now if I change the modifier to 1 plus the number of PCs, and that's what that $ PC is, on the party sheet. Now remember, it doesn't take consideration the party levels and the CR, it's just the number. So it takes 1 plus the number of PCs, so this encounter should actually be 5. And it is. So there's 2 encounters now, one that has 5, one that has 4. And you can also do multiplication. So I'm going to go 2 times, so 2 asterisk the number of PCs, hit generate, and that's 10. That's an awful lot. And then you can also divide it. So I'm going to say the $ PC, or the number of player characters, divided by 2. And that should give me 2.5 or something like that. So yeah, so 2.5, it'll round down. There's no such thing as half a goblin in this case. And you can actually just change the number, but it's only going to give you the lowest denominator. It'll round down. So there's the 2. So you can change these values depending on the situation, what you want it to do. So in this case, with 5 players being low level like this, I would probably use this. So it's going to only be half the number of players, rounded down, for this encounter for reinforcements. So rather than having a whole nother contingent of goblins, I will just have half the number of party members rounded down. So you could take something like that and either pin it to the map. So in this case, I could pin it over here just in case I want access to it and I don't have to look for it later. Or you can also pin this in your story entry by unlocking it, taking the link, and just dragging it down here at the bottom, and essentially just kind of making your own thing out of this. So you're not relegated to what exactly they have. So you can just put optional encounter. And this is for yourself, right? This is not really necessarily for anyone else. You're running this campaign, you can do whatever you want. So optional encounter, and I'm just going to make this so it stands out. And then I always bold these just so I can, it kind of catches my eye, kind of like it is up here. So essentially, this is going to be a way that you can embellish or add to the campaign or make it more interesting. So that's one way to do it. And again, you can always go back and make a structured one where it's always going to be the same number. So that would be, in this case, for your NPCs, you can drag and drop a goblin onto a blank encounter. So if I go back to encounters, that was a random encounter I did earlier. So this one is the one that you can edit and just kind of manually add your own with no randomization. So again, I can bring this up, just drag over one just for the start of it, and maybe another two. So we'll say reinforcements on this one as well. And what happens is all the generated ones that I had from earlier are in this column now. So this is where the goblins of 4, 5, 10, all the different variations are in here. So I could actually use these so I don't even have to generate it. I can just go, okay, this encounter has 4. So what I might do is change the name of this encounter to times 4. That way I know what the increment is. And then this one was the 2. So this is, we'll say times 0.5, because that's half. And then you have this one, which is 10. So you can say times 2. Or you can say 10, whatever the quantities are. You can do that too. So it's just up to you how you want to basically set up and manipulate your adventure. So these are just things you can do with Fantasy Grounds. It's a very powerful tool. And it's something that you definitely want to get used to with the modular windows and being able to layer these. So now to the next step. Let's just run with this basic encounter. So I'll pop that up again. Let's see, where did that go? Did I get rid of it? Okay, so here's the encounter. I'm going to hit the down arrow. Now there's some caveats about building these encounters and setting them up. So right now, the default settings for this particular encounter is if I add these two goblins, they're both going to have the exact same initiative, the exact same hit points. So if you don't like that, you can actually change that before you add anything to your table. So for instance, combat, NPC hit points, it's on standard. That means it's going to take the standard hit points that's populated in this window and go with that. Or you can tell it to roll 2d6 so you can get a random number instead of the static number. So now if I actually change that to maximum, that'll go to the max, like 12 hit points. Random will roll the 2d6 instead of going with 7. The other thing I can change is the actual diagonal distance of movement. So here it's on default. So when I move something, let me lock. Okay, it is locked. So if I hold down the Alt key as the GM, I can kind of emulate player movement. So when you move diagonally with the standard movement on, you're actually moving quite far away. So this is kind of a big movement in reality. So if I was going to change that diagonal movement to 1.5, you've actually moved 35 feet instead of 30. So this counts every other square diagonally as an additional square, and it counts against you. So in this case, this would be you move too far. So then I would deny the movement. I say, okay, now move. So this player is going to go ahead and move. So I'll move her diagonally. You got to hold the Alt key if I'm the GM to get that pointer. There and there. So she can move like that, but she has this river to cross. So at the minimum, I would say that she's going to at least lose 5 to 10 feet of movement. So you got to keep in consideration. Or if she was trying to go through these bushes, it would take her twice as long to get through it. Because it did state that you can't just go through it. You got to pick your way. So this is something that you got to consider when you're playing, are obstacles and what's actually there painted on the map. A lot of players will just kind of bulldoze through there and they don't really think about the terrain. But in this case, since she has to cross the creek, it might do a couple of things. So one, she's wearing heavy armor. So I might say, okay, if you want to go investigate what's on the other side of that thicket, and you're going to be stealthy or try to be quiet, you're going to have a lot of things going against you. You have heavy armor on, you have to cross a creek, and you have to remain quiet. And when you move silently or when you're trying to move stealthily, you can only move half your movement rate. Her movement rate is 30 feet, but she can only actually move 15. And with the river on and all that in the way, I might let her get to the other side of the river. And then she still has to roll a stealth check. So let's see if she's able to do that. So this is the high elf, so I'll just pass the turn. And if she wants to move across the river to the other side, she's not going to be able to do so if she's going to move silently. So in this case, she doesn't have heavy armor, so she's not going to actually have that issue. So I don't have to penalize her on her skill check to get across. So her stealth is probably all right. She's not proficient in it, but she's still got a +2 from her dex. So I'm going to roll against the goblins. Let's see. Let me put the goblins on the combat tracker first. So I'm going to hit the down arrow, and the goblins are now on there. And I need to place them because I took their placement off. So I'll just drag them manually from the combat tracker. That's the other way that you can add. And then if they become visible, I will turn them on with these little eyeballs. But in this case, they're not. So I'll just leave it like that for now. And what you can do is you bring up their character sheets and you look at their passive perception. So that's what you want to look at. That's the number they have to beat if they are to be successful with moving quietly. And then I'm going to give them the advantage that the river kind of masks the sound. And it said in the previous passage that these goblins weren't paying attention, that they were partying and talking and they weren't really doing their job. So I'm going to give her advantage on the roll just because of the sound of the creek and the goblins, kind of not paying attention. So their passive perception is 9. All she has to do is beat this 9. So if I come over here and I want to roll against 9, I'm just going to go ahead and have her drag this stealth in the dice tower. That way she won't see the result, but she knows that she's rolling against something. So I'll have her left click and drag, drop it into the dice tower, and she rolled an 11. I didn't even have to give her advantage because she actually made it. Had I did, though, I would have her click on the ADV button, which is advantage, and drag and drop the stealth roll again in the dice tower. And that would have given her a 13 overall. So she still made it either way. But nonetheless, she's quiet. She's going to be able to make it across the creek. So I'm going to hold down the Alt key and drag it across. And that's about as far as I'm going to let her go. So she can make it across there without being noticed, including trudging through the water and everything else. So they didn't notice her. And also the thicket kind of absorbed some of the sound. So you got to kind of use some of your imagination on how to homebrew or how to judge that. She really can only move 15 feet, but she's not going to end up in the water. So she's probably right at the edge of the creek. So that would be her turn, essentially. And then I'd have her pass her turn. So that's the sort of thing you do to for obstacles or traps or anything like that. You can adjudicate or judge whether or not they need their, advantage, disadvantage, all that kind of stuff. Now, as far as the combat goes, if these guys make noise, these guys are going to attack. So far, they're okay. Now, the Lightfoot criminal is going to move in. So I'm going to click on the link over here on the right, which will bring the character sheet up where I wanted it. And I'll go to the Actions tab. And on his sheet, you can see he's got his consumables, racial abilities, and then he has some other things. So I'm going to change the mode down here to combat and action. So this is kind of what you want to see when you're playing as a character. And in this case, he is going to use his stealth. I'm going to put on this note where he's naturally stealthy. So if he hangs out next to one of his fellow players, he can gain the hide. So he's going to hide next to her. So I'm going to have him move across. He's not even going to move silently. He's just going to move across. So I'm going to have him hold. I'm going to hold the Alt key as the GM, move him over here, and then go ahead and approve it. So he just moves across, no problems. I could have had him roll a stealth check. More than likely he'll make it because that's one of the things and he would have advantage. So click advantage, go to stealth, but he couldn't move quite as far. So that's something you have to keep in mind. And he's double proficient in that. So I can left click and drag this into the dice tower. And yeah, so he made it anyway. So either way, he made it across. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes it's better just to hand wave stuff like that. Sometimes, though, the failure is just as sweet. So we'll see. So he made it across. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the down arrow again. Now it's the hill dwarf. So the hill dwarf is going to just move up to the edge of the creek up here. So I'm going to go ahead and hold down the Alt key. And he's not going to cross the river because he knows he ain't going to be much help if he makes any noise. So I'm going to have him move here. And as the GM, I'll go ahead and approve it. He's not trying to move silently yet before we even worry about that. As long as he didn't trip and fall, these guys aren't going to notice. So he's fine right there. And it tells you that in the last encounter, it tells you that they're not paying attention. So that's to his advantage. So that's that. He might actually listen and see if he can hear anything, and he might hand signal the rest of the group, hey, I hear something. There's someone back there, but he's not going to say it. He's just going to use hand gestures. Maybe, give them a signal. So the human noble is going to pull out his, he's got a light crossbow, a great axe. He's going to take his great axe out, and he's going to use it with one hand, not two. And what he's going to do is move across the creek, and I'm going to have him roll actually stealth for that. And let's see how far he can get. He can probably get to about there at the most. But I think what he's going to do is he's going to move up here and then just move over closer to the dwarf. And that way I don't have to roll, do all the extra rolls. And he's actually just going to be content right there. So they're kind of moving into place. So then I'm going to hit the down arrow, and now it goes to the goblins. So they don't notice anything. They're still talking, and they're not paying attention. So I can pass through their turns with the down arrow here. And then I can make them visible too at this point, because the players can't really see them through the thicket. And I want to show you what that looks like for a player. So I'm looking at this through the GM view. Very important to realize where you're at in the line of sight. So I'm going to unlock this map. And what you're going to see here is that there is the enable or disable light that needs to be on if you want to take advantage of the occluders. And the ambient light outside is on too. So then the next thing is I'm going to enable the player view, which is going to look like this as a player. So if I click on any token, that's what the actual view is like. So these two goblins can't see the players at all. So when you select a token on the map, that's the view that you're looking through. So it changes slightly as you cycle through the players. So this player has that view, this player has that view, so on and so forth. And then this NPC can see this, and then this NPC can see that. So that's important to know this, and that's why I put it in this player preview mode, so you can get an idea of what you're looking at. So when you're the game master, you actually have to claim the token of who you're looking through. And that's where a lot of people get confused. If you unclick one of these, you're going to see more of the map. Or if you have this claimed and you're actually running the goblin, you're like, hey, you can't see anything. Well, that's because you don't have it. You don't have them actually clicked on. So the combat tracker does not change the vision. So if I click the down arrow to pass the turn to the human folk hero, it highlights the folk hero, but I'm still looking through the eyes of the goblin. So I need to click on the folk hero in order to get an idea of what they're looking at. And that's important as the GM. The player usually doesn't have that problem unless they have 2 tokens. It's the GM that gets confused more than anything else because you're controlling lots of different pieces of this. So you got to be kind of wary of that. When you're running combat, you want to make sure that you're actually clicking on the token that's on the map. The other common complaint is that the map is completely black. So that could mean a lot of things, but if you're a player, it could be that it's dark and you don't have a candle. There's no torches, there's nothing, or you don't have dark vision. So naturally, you're not going to see anything, especially if you're in an underground cavern. The other thing that may happen is that sometimes the players, when they connect to the table, they might be blocked by their computer. So if you have one player that can't see the map, but everyone else can, it could likely be that that player has blocked data from their computer. So that could be a firewall, antivirus, parent controls, whatever. All those sort of things can add to that problem. So you want to check with your player, if it's only one of them, that they cannot, if they can't see anything and they're having problems looking at the map, sometimes just closing the map and reopening it actually fixes that problem. So that's one thing that can, that actually can make a difference. Sometimes the players have not clicked on their token yet. So this player here, he says, oh crap, I closed the map. So all he has to do is double click on his token or on the character sheet and click on the token over here, and that will bring up the map. So if I double click on the right here on the token, it brings up the last map that I was on. And then I'm going to say, okay, now click on your token. So once they do that, it might start showing some things because they may not have claimed their token just. Once they do, though, they shouldn't have to do it again. Unless they're running 2 characters, then that can get confusing because you have to click between both characters. So it just depends on what you're doing. But just remember to click on the token that you're operating with. Otherwise, you're not going to see what that exact token is looking at. Now, if you turn off the player preview, you're going to get the overview as the GM. It's a little harder to tell who has what vision, but you see it's kind of grayed out over here. So you can sort of see it, but I usually run the encounter with the preview on at all times. So that way I can get a better idea of what these guys are looking at. Because if I have it in the GM mode, it's very hard to tell depending on what's happening. So that's a pretty common mistake or a misconception when people are running encounters that have occluders and that line of sight data. So this data here is going to block the vision, including this green stuff here. And if you don't have a light source and it's dark out and you don't have dark vision or anything like that, it's going to be a completely black screen. So that player is either going to have to get a torch, or if that's not the case, they're going to have to check their computer to make sure that the data from the map is not being blocked by their computer. So they might still be able to connect to your table, which is them connecting to you, but when data goes from the host to the player, it might be getting blocked by some sort of antivirus or firewall or whatever. So if you're installing Fantasy Grounds for the first time, make sure that you agree or accept the firewall exclusion. Usually when you first install Fantasy Grounds, a pop-up will come up. Not always, but when that does, you need to let it through. Otherwise, when you connect to a table, you might have trouble getting the actual data from your host. If it is everyone that cannot see the map, and likely it's something to do on the GM's end, they may not have the map set up right, or maybe their computer's blocked. But nonetheless, that's a troubleshooting step. The other thing you can do temporarily is to remove the player from the map. So just click on this human folk hero, right click, delete the token. Don't delete the combat tracker, but just the token, and then re-drag the token back where it was. And that sometimes fixes it too. Once in a while, the data between the player, the map, and the character sheet gets broken. That could happen during updates or GMs using some sort of extension or whatever. That can break that occasionally. But normally it's just a matter of opening the map and closing it, or removing the token off the combat tracker and then adding it back, or off the map, not the combat tracker. And then starting from there. That's your first troubleshooting steps. The other ones are a little bit more time consuming and annoying, where they have to actually disconnect from the table and check their computer out. So it just really depends. The Atlassian guide on the internet for Fantasy Grounds, the Fantasy Grounds Atlassian, has an article on there for troubleshooting networks. So if you ever run across that, start with that article first, and then start checking with your GM and your players on the settings and such for their computer. There's always one guy that has problems. The other thing could be wireless, like if you don't have enough bandwidth, that's another issue. So could be a lot of things. But nonetheless, these are just some tips to kind of get you started with the actual process of getting to your combat and getting all the stuff set up, plus some things to look out for, some tips. What's nice about this is now that I have everything in place, when I actually close all this and I come back to this, let's say I've saved the game and I've kind of shut down for the day, I close all this stuff, and this is kind of what I'll come back to when I first start up Fantasy Grounds. So if that's the case, I'm going to bring up the section we were in. I'm going to bring up the map, click on the combat tracker, and then these little shortcuts on the right-hand side is going to bring up all the NPCs and the players that I had earlier. So this makes it so much simpler to use. There's a couple of these bookmarks down here, or these shortcuts, and then have all your windows laid out where you want them. You're not going to be fighting it as much. If you don't have the time to set this window up, or to set the desktop up the way you want, just start doing it as you go. That way, as you play, you start to understand which windows you're going to need, which ones you don't, and then next time you play, it won't be such a scramble to figure out where everything is. So that's where a lot of people fight the interface, is they're not used to where things go and where they get set. So they just kind of start moving stuff around. What they don't realize is that wherever you leave the window is where it's going to pop up the next time you need it, or next time you access it. So if I wanted to bring up the tables, they're going to be right smack dab in the middle. So the next time I move these, or I want this data, I'm going to actually move this down here so it's not right covering anything, or it's out of the way. So now when I close the tables, and if I bring it back up again during play for some reason, I mean, I probably won't, because it's usually embedded in the adventure. But if I do, it's going to be where I last left it. So get in the habit of placing your window, stretching the frame of the window to where you want it to be, the sizing, and then close it. If you move it out of the way and you close it, then when you go to open it up again, it's going to be somewhere where else you don't want it to be. So just remember that. That's a really big thing that really helps a lot. Once you get your mind wrapped around that, this gets a little easier. And then as far as the map goes, that can get confusing if you don't have the correct tokens selected, or if your player is having trouble viewing the map because of technical issues, or maybe the map's not set up right, or maybe the data is corrupted between the map, the player, and the character sheet. So sometimes when Fantasy Grounds updates, the link between them gets corrupted, something's changed or whatever, or maybe you got corrupted save, who knows. So speaking of save, last thing I want to mention is when you're done with a session and everyone's logged off your table, or if you're a player, you're working on building a character, the correct way to exit Fantasy Grounds is to right-click, click on this little exit session button, and then click return to launcher. That's the most safest way to exit Fantasy Grounds. That way you don't corrupt your data, and if you made any last minute edits, you're not going to lose those, because sometimes when you exit out quickly, you're going to actually lose data. So if you just X straight out of it and you've made a bunch of changes, it may not have had time to save it. So nonetheless, take care, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. I hope some of this helped. I don't always know what content to put out, but I try to put out useful content. So if you come across these situations, such as the combat here that I was showing you, I showed you the setup, some of the things to look out for, some of the most common problems with those. And a lot of this will still apply to other rule sets. So even though the mechanics aren't the same, the setup, the map, all the placement of the windows, all that sort of stuff still applies. So you take care, everyone. Bye-bye, and we'll see you.